Good morning. My name is Joel Reidenberg. I am a professor at Fordham University and the director of the Fordham Center on Law and Information Policy. We're very pleased to be a partner with CPDP this year, and I really want to say thank you to the organizing committee. I think they've done a spectacular job putting together a really impressive program. Our panel topic this morning is privacy and missing persons after disasters. This is a relatively unexplored issue for privacy law scholars on the academic side. But we know that disasters can happen anywhere. And what we also know is that the disaster response results in information flows to connect families that are global. They happen anywhere. Families can be dispersed. Relief agencies come from distant places. And the personal information that is involved in connecting and finding missing persons after a disaster is quite significant. The technology and disaster relief communities have been seeking efficient solutions to help people reconnect with their loved ones. There is a group that's been quite active in this field, the Missing Persons Community of Interest, that was really spearheaded by Tim Schwartz, who's one of our panelists this morning. Both the technology and the disaster communities realized that the privacy issues were quite complex. Our center, in conjunction with some of the panelists, did an extensive study of this last year. And we'll hear a little bit more about some of the research findings. But the panel this morning is essentially going to look at three things. We're going to first start by taking a look and having the different organizations represented talk about what they do with personal information to help find missing people. The second is then to think about how privacy laws affect it and how they can affect the sharing across borders. And then third, as we'll then move into a discussion, is look at what can be done to facilitate the development of missing person information systems in ways consistent with privacy laws and responsibility. We have an absolutely terrific panel for the topic. My job is going to be keeping time and being very unforgiving if anyone tries to run over time. We anticipate having probably about 25-30 minutes for discussion and question and answer at the conclusion of the initial presentations. I'll quickly introduce the members of the panel. I know there's more extensive biographical information on the website. Bob Gellman, who is our moderator, Bob on the side, is a privacy and information policy consultant in Washington. He was the co-author of the Privacy and Missing Persons After Natural Disasters project. We have a couple copies if anyone's interested. And a long-serving staff member of the United States Congress working on privacy issues. Next we have Tim Schwartz. Where's Tim? There's Tim. Tim is an artist, technologist, and activist, and really one of the founding forces behind the missing persons community of interest in trying to have dialogue among the technologists and the disaster relief community. We have Romain Bircher from the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. He's been with the Red Cross since 1989, is it? And spearheaded the Restoring Family Links, heads data protection at the ICRC. Then we have Christopher Mikkelson over here, who is a social entrepreneur in Denmark and the co-founder of Refugees United, which works to, I think they developed one of the first search engines for missing persons and platform technologies to help identify missing people. Nigel Snoad, I hope I pronounced it properly. Snoad, sorry.
It's like what's going on in New York right now.
Yes, who's project manager with Google's crisis response team in the UK. He's previously worked on research and development for humanitarian systems at Microsoft and spent time serving at the United Nations on pandemic contingency planning. And last but certainly not least, Hiroshi Miyashita, who is a professor at Chuo University in Japan. and he has served in the Prime Minister's office working on privacy issues, as well as having been a member of the delegation of Japan to various privacy meetings and conferences at the OECD, APEC, and the International Data Protection Commissioners Conference. So with that, we're going to start with Tim Schwartz.
Hi, thank you, Joel. I'll just briefly say the MPCI, Missing Persons Community of Interest, was formed after the Haiti earthquake in 2010. Generally, it came out of conference calls after that and a need to share information and lessons learned between various missing persons applications and systems. Since then, we've had a number of in-person meetings and a lot of conference calls. We've been able to work with Joel and Bob to publish this report, and we've also concentrated on building documents revolving around best practices for these systems, best practices in terms of privacy, and in general, doing after-action reports after large-scale disasters. We span an international context from ICRC to Google to American Red Cross, Australian Red Cross, and others. So it's really an open space comprised of international humanitarian relief organizations, private sector companies, local disaster management, nonprofits, and technical volunteer communities. So that's about it. I'll keep it very brief, but say that this afternoon we're having another meeting to review what happened in the Philippines and some other things. So, thank you.
Yeah. Good morning. So before speaking about the website, because the ICRC typical approach, I want to speak about the organization, because what I really believe is that the website that we have, the website we all have different websites, it does reflect the culture of the organization, where we are organized and the series of choices that we make. So I would qualify the ICRC as a very stubborn organization, because for two reasons. For 150 years, it has had the same general mandate, mission statement, really protecting the life and dignity of people affected by conflict. The second reason that we kept the same principle for 150 years, 7 principles, but the most important are independence of the ICRC. We are not part, we do not depend on governments, we do not depend on the United Nations. We do cooperate with the United Nations, but we are not coordinated by them. And impartiality, it means bringing assistance to the people in need really according to the needs, based on needs-based analysis. So it means at the same time, ICRC has changed a lot. When I started in 1989, I was a delegate in Kabul. I was visiting Pulisharki prison. It has changed a lot in the past 20 years. So we expanded our programs, we expanded and we changed the methodology and the tool that we used. So mostly, as a range of activities is very large, so it means it's program of sanitation, it's bringing relief to people affected, to displaced, to refugee camps, and also what we call protection programs. It means visiting people in prisons in order to ascertain, to assess their living condition and discussing with the authorities in order to improve their conditions. Part of this program, what we have is restoring family links. Restoring family links is really helping people who have been separated from their families due to various reasons. It could be conflict, it could be natural disasters, or it could be due to migrations. So helping them to get in touch, to get news of their families, ascertain the fate of the missing person. So to do restoring family links, I mean, it involves a range of different methods. The most simple is the most difficult. It's really sitting down with the family, discussing about the circumstances of disappearances, documenting the case, and then trying to find leads. So it means really going to the place where the people have disappeared, going to refugee camps, going to hospitals, going to mortuaries, going to prisons, discussing with the authorities, trying to find leads, trying to find witnesses. It's a very long process. It can take weeks, it can take months, sometimes it takes years. That's a commitment that we have. Another kind of services we can do is really advising the authorities on managing the dead bodies. Because how you manage dead bodies, you might be able then to find evidence and to identify, to put a name to a body, and then to notify the family accordingly. Then we have organization of family reunification. For example, children who have been separated from their families, being able to reunite them physically with their families. Then we also have, telephone contact organized, VTC, video telephone conferences, all kinds of means for people who don't have other means to restore contact and maintain contact with their families. And then I will come to the online part, publishing list of names of people who are missing or people who are alive. So we have a website, it's called familylinks.icrc.org. And there, on this website, ICRC was really one of the first humanitarian organizations to set up such a website to restore family links. It's a long time ago. It's kind of prehistory when you look at the history of internet. It was in 1995, it was in Bosnia. So in Bosnia, after the Dayton Agreement, when there was a peace among the parties, we decided to publish online the list of all the missing individuals we had from the war in Bosnia. There were up to 20,000 names. And what is interesting to know is that this list still does exist, because a lot of people we have been able, to ascertain the fate, to clarify the fate of certain individuals, but there are still 7,800 missing persons related to the war in Bosnia. It's 19 years ago, it's a long time. So when I look at the website, I would say that the website that we have has three main purposes. First, it's a main entry point for us to direct people to the right Red Cross services, so they can find people who can help them, who can listen to their case, who can take their cases. It's also a tool to collect information that will not be published, that we can treat internally. And finally, it's also a tool to publish names online when we think it's relevant to publish names. So we have three different options. We can decide not to publish any names because of the sensitivity of the situation, but to treat all cases confidentially. For example, Egypt was a case where we have a situation of political violence. There was a decision taken not to publish any names related to the events in Egypt, because we never know how the names might be used, how the information might be misused by the parties. It was a political situation. The same decision was taken in Libya, in Syria, and Ivory Coast. We can use then a very controlled way to publish names. We decide which name we want to publish. We don't let people self-register themselves. This is the option we had in Bosnia. This is the option we activated in Nepal, in Kosovo. So it means we had a long talk with the family, and they agreed that the name is published, and we really think it is in the best interest of the missing person to keep this issue alive and to call for testimonies. The third option is letting people self-register. This is an option we rarely activate, and it's mostly following mass natural disasters. So this is the option we activate in Haiti, but we have less control, of course, on the data that we have. So I will make six very simple points to explain how we make this decision. First, the first point, I would say context is key. Context is important. It should be context-based decision. A decision that we take in such a context to activate such an option might not be a good decision in another context. You have to understand, what is at stake, what are the risks. The second point is really to distinguish between natural disaster affecting peaceful countries and affected and country situation affected by political violence and conflict. The third point, it comes as a consequence, is really to try to consult the field, the people in the field, or delegation in the field, Red Cross National Society, to see what are the risks and what are the options. So it means that we might not be very fast, but we need to reflect what options is the most useful, is the less risky for the people. The fourth point is that websites should complement and should not replace the field services that we have. It's very important to be in the affected area. It's very important to bring a real service to the people, concrete service to the people, and you need physical interaction to bring physical assistance as well. And the fifth point is that really trying to provide a service that people can trust. It means limited information, but as far as we can, if it is possible, reliable information. For that, it's difficult because it requires teams to manage the data. It requires people on the ground in the affected areas. It requires relationship with the authorities to get access to privileged access to reliable data. The last point is really to enable people, if possible, to take control over the data. Data of the people, it's their data, it's not our data. We are a repository of this data, and we have taken them according to a specific and clear purpose, and we should use it that way.
Thank you. Christopher, do you want to take the...
Give it a shot. Thank you. So Refugees United is an organization entirely focused on mobile technologies and assisting displaced people across the world in reconnecting with family members and friends they've lost contact to during their escape from political conflict, upheavals, natural disasters, and so on. We work predominantly in East Africa with a clear focus on Congolese, Sudanese, Somali, and Ethiopian refugees, though we have a smattering of others on the platform as well. And we shaped the organization a few years ago in response to what we witnessed being a lack of an IT infrastructure that could collect, curate, and distribute information on separated people, not only amongst the different organizations working with refugees and other displaced people, but also with the people in question themselves. So the way we operate is through very low-tech mobile platforms where we will work in a refugee camp like Dadaab in Kenya, for example, the world's largest with 500,000 people, in deep partnership with the Kenyan Red Cross. We provide mobile teams that are on ground, basically go from house to house, collect information on those separated, and that gets input to our database. At the other end of the spectrum of that partnership is our work with large-scale mobile operators in Kenya, for example, Safaricom, in Somaliland, Telesom, Vodafone, Vodacom, and so on across all countries we operate in, where we enter a partnership where they help us distribute information through their entire user base. So in a place like DRC right now, we work with Vodacom and we go in and then we kind of prospect where are the biggest caseloads of people displaced and with the highest chance of them having become separated from family members, and then we shoot out millions of text messages to each of the phones that we find increasingly, as you all know as well, more and more people have, even at the bottom of the pyramid. We then provide them access to the platforms we provide through SMS, where they can register and search, through a protocol called USSD, which is a kind of real-time SMS, and then through a call center, which enables the oftentimes illiterate refugees to call us, become registered, gather information on those they're looking for, and even to reconnect on the phone as such. It's, to us, an important project insofar that it assists not just the organizations in working around mobile-based platforms and gearing up to have, I'd say, high-tech operations within refugee camps, but that it empowers refugees themselves to be very active parts of the process to locate what has happened to their family members. It's a very efficient way of working. To give you a quick smattering of numbers, we're currently helping about 275,000 refugees in their search for missing family, and adding approximately 500 people to the platform a day. We are generating about 140,000 phone calls to our call center every month from the 4 groups that we predominantly serve, and who we cannot help all of them because we simply are not that big an organization, but are getting better and better at helping tens of thousands of people with access to crucial information about where their loved ones may be. And then as soon as we can reconnect them, we hand over the tasks to the likes of the ICRC, UNHCR, and other large-scale organizations that have the mandate to physically reunify families. We come to this project with very much a mindset that says data should be shared. We should protect the privacy and information of people, of course, and they should be left in charge of what they want to publish to the world. But as such, it is our firm belief that this information should be as open as possible, should be shared amongst organizations, should be shared with all the interested parts of this community, so that we, at the end of the day, focus on what's most important, which is to reconnect more families faster than we've been doing up until now. Thank you.
Thank you. Nigel.
Sure. Might need a... Yep. Hi, I'm Nigel Snoad. Actually coming from New York last night, where somehow I magically escaped the snowstorm at the last minute. So for anyone who knows me, seeing me in a tie is probably a sort of a heart-stopping experience, so I forgive everybody who's watching who happens to have seen me before. So I'm the product manager for Google's crisis response team, which most people in this room probably have never heard of. And Google actually has a social impact group whose mission is actually to sort of basically do good, if you like. And we have a crisis response team that is responsible for trying to provide information to people affected by crises, mostly natural disasters, so that they can take better actions to improve their situation, to understand what's going on in their lives, and to help official responders as well to figure out what's going on. And in this context, we've got some interesting sort of things to talk about. And it's great to hear Romain and Christopher go ahead of me, because we have a tool called PersonFinder, and we've deployed it. It was basically built in a hackathon in about 72 hours in 2010 in response to the Haiti earthquake, with a lot of Googlers involved and many others from around the sort of global internet community, if you like. It was built because at that time, and Tim can correct me on this, there was something like 15 to 25 different notice boards that the diaspora, the Haitian diaspora, were posting missing persons requests and lists of information. And so if you were someone who was wondering what had happened to your loved ones, right, you went to 25 different sites, and it probably was on the 26th one was where there was information about what had happened. Right? And local networks were filling in the gaps, but people didn't know where to go. So we were looking to find a way to try and aggregate that information that was already being published and make it available to anyone who was critically interested in what had happened to the people they cared about. And so this was built as a database, but it was critically built on top of a data format, PFIF, PersonFinder, PeopleFinder interchange format, that was meant to find a way. It had been around for many years since Hurricane Katrina. I was kind of involved in helping support it back then in 2005. Has a provenance back to 2001, actually, after the World Trade Center bombing. And the goal was to find a way that these various different missing person sources could actually share information once it had actually been sort of explicitly provided to the public. And so PersonFinder has evolved since then, and one of the largest circumstances it's been used as an example was in 2011 after the Tohoku earthquake in Japan, where there was something like 620,000 people registered as either missing or okay. Because PersonFinder as a database is a tool for ordinary citizens to be able to say, I have information about someone, which could be myself, I could be okay, or I'm looking for information about someone. Here's the person, here's the details I have, can you help me find this? And it's all very explicitly public. The notices are very clear that we make to people. And so when we talk about PersonFinder, it's really important to distinguish between sort of three different things. And sometimes I'll skip between them, so forgive me. And it's a challenge when talking about Google like this, is that one thing is it's a data model. This PersonFinder interchange format is a data model. It's a data life cycle. We talk about what happens to the records and what you should do with it once you sort of data stewardship, if you like, in this circumstance. It's a data format for exchanging data between PersonFinder databases, and we have integrations with various companies and various organizations, non-profits, government groups, and telco operators, for instance, who all provide missing person services. And it's an open source project where the data resides in each instance, and then it's a Google established instance when we set it up after a large disaster. It's actually great to hear Romain talk about how the Red Cross approaches this, because Google's approaches to missing persons is very much in the rapid onset, for the most part, natural disaster. It's a short-lived, high-impact circumstance where we, in consultation with sort of the response community, the international response community, determine there's a huge number of people who are displaced, who are looking for the information about their loved ones, either because it's a diaspora or because it's actually people who are sort of relocated to another circumstance. And particularly when we see that there's a large amount of data being posted online, that people are explicitly searching and having no good place to go. And so then we stand up Google PersonFinder, and it becomes, we hope, a locus for people to share their information about who they're looking for and what's going on. The nice thing about PersonFinder is because it's not only an app that has SMS and various other interfaces, it's also got an API where we can integrate with various other services. So for instance, there's many circumstances, and one great one is in Japan, where NTT Docomo automatically integrates their messaging services with PersonFinder on every earthquake greater than sort of magnitude 5. It's not an international magnitude 5, it's a local magnitude shaking intensity 5, as I've been educated recently. And so if someone is in an earthquake in Japan, they can always send a message on their local phone to a set number that NTT Docomo provides to look up the information about one of their loved ones. And if PersonFinder has it or they can register it, then they're part of that community of people looking for each other. So I could talk significantly more about some of the things that are involved with this, but I think one of the things that's really important for this is we've got a huge number of phenomenal stories of people who come online looking for their loved ones, scramble over the place to find out what's going on, post queries all over the place. And then we're very fortunate, thanks to mostly to our partners who provide the information, who do the on-the-ground collection. Google's reach in many countries is not as extensive as we'd like, so we have to work and should work through partners, NGOs, media organizations, and others, to sort of basically post queries about what's happening and do quite a large number of successful searches for people they're looking for. Some of my, I spent sort of more than a decade doing on-the-ground relief work, and some of the best stories I've actually had are some of the messages we get as feedback through PersonFinder, frankly, from people who found each other, and it's quite gratifying. I'm sure we'll talk more about the privacy implications and other issues when we go into the panel. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Hiroshi?
Well, thank you. I will provide a very concrete example from our experience in Japan. At 2:46 p.m. on March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake hit Tohoku and northeast Japan. It killed more than 15,000 people. 2,651 are still missing, and more than 600 people were injured. The biggest tsunami completely destroyed more than 26,000 houses and damaged more than 1 million houses. After the nuclear power station accident in Fukushima, maximum 346,000 people took shelter. So Japan has a after the earthquake, we have a very big challenge between the tension between the privacy and the missing person. We do have a comprehensive privacy law in 2003, and it provides exemptions to the general principles when disclosure about the information sharing without consent of the data subject when necessary to protect the life, body, or property of a person. We also have several guidelines on missing person and privacies. We just amended our Disaster Countermeasures Act last year in order to make a list for the person in need of support in emergency. We also amended our guidelines to use geolocation information, GPS information, only necessary for the protection of the imminent serious danger. Well, however, these exemptions are not clear enough in emergency. So we had big challenges after the earthquake. Well, this is a classical way to find a missing person after the earthquake because electricity was completely off a few days after earthquake. So we need to use the phone, social media, or other practical devices. But the dilemma is that electricity was off for a few days after the earthquake. So the telecommunication bases were destroyed in Tohoku area. So most of the people just use a very classical way to find the person. But after the few days, the electricity recovered, we saw many useful information tools. NHK, which Nigel just mentioned about the collaboration with NTT Docomo Telecommunications and Group PersonFinder. NHK provided this kind of broadcasted missing person information. More than 10,000 persons were broadcasted for finding discovering the missing persons. Also, telephone companies started finding persons system through voice messages. More than 2.7 million messages were recorded within just 1 week after the earthquake. Also, the social media, which just Nigel mentioned, we used Google PersonFinder, and there were 3 million users within 3 weeks after the earthquake for the Google PersonFinder. We also used Red Cross Family Link, which is very popular in Japan as well. Also, Tweet had more than 1,200 every minute within 1 hour after the earthquake. Tweet, which contains earthquake, had more than 246,000 just 1 day on March 11th. Skype users has also increased. And also, this is a local government also provided a missing person information on their website, and this is a concrete example for the missing person information. We also saw the big data analysis on the people's behavior after the earthquake from the car navigation, geolocation information from social media. This big data analysis taught us that many people could not escape from tsunami due to the heavy traffic. If people could know this kind of heavy traffic in advance, thousands of lives may have been saved. And I'd like to summarize 3 points with regard to the privacy and missing person from our experience in the earthquake in Japan. The first is that as a resolution of the 33rd International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners says, all of the stakeholders, government, privacy commissioners, and local governments, also the social media companies, should review the existing privacy policies in emergency. In our experience in Japan, there is no big privacy issues immediately after the earthquake. But think about 1 month after the earthquake. The people have no identification, and how can the government or banks can identify the people? Is the personal data reserved through the off-site backup or remote storage? How can the government collaborate with the social media? There's a temporal order, which we refer to the New Zealand order. Does the temporal order on information sharing properly respected so that the temporal information was deleted after the necessary purpose? We must review these kind of issues. The second thing is that social media is extremely useful, but we must take into account the information from social media comes from the ordinary people, not the professional editors and reporters. That the information in social media may sometimes contain the false and wrong information, as we particularly saw in Twitter in Japanese cases. The final and the third thing is that the earthquake big data draws enormous attention to analyze people's behavior after the earthquake. After big data project, we understand many people escaped from the raw place from tsunami, but the evidence of the car navigation showed the heavy traffic jam prevented their escape. So geolocation and GPS information may be extremely useful, not only for finding missing persons, but also how we take shelter in a safe way in emergency. But again, geolocation information is regarded as sensitive information. So we now must make a balance between the useful of GPS information and privacy.
Fantastic, thank you. Bob, I turn over to our moderator. Thank you. In organizing this panel, Joel and I thought it was most important to get the facts out, that what is it that missing persons organizations are doing and how they're doing it. But you can only hide from the law for so long before you have to confront it, and that's what I want to talk about. The report that Joel and I and some others did took a look at missing persons privacy issues in the context of the US and the EU as exemplars of legal regimes around the world. And for the US, it's too glib to say there's no privacy law, but it's pretty close. And so I'm not going to talk about the US very much. In the EU, there are a couple of points that I want to go over. First, if you are a missing persons organization in the EU, you need to have a legitimate basis for the processing of personal data. You obviously, in a missing persons, and our focus was on missing persons in natural disasters, the idea of obtaining consent is simply impractical. I don't think it's worth talking about that since it's so obvious. The other bases for processing information that are relevant are that the processing is in the vital interest of the data subject, that it is in the public interest, or that the processing is in the legitimate interest of the data controller unless it's overridden by the fundamental rights of data subjects. I think there are arguments for all of those. In the foreword to our report, Blair Stewart from New Zealand, who was extremely helpful to us in the preparation of the report, I thought managed to distill the entire missing persons effort into a few words. He said, it's essential in the cause of common humanity. However, that's not to say that it is necessarily in the vital interest of a data subject, in the public interest, et cetera. And what's missing here is an official recognition in a data protection context that disasters qualify under at least one of these bases for processing. When does the authority to process data in a disaster begin? When does it stop? How much sharing is vital or is in the public interest? These lines are not clear. Who is a missing person? Is a found person still a missing person? And someone who was found in one context may be missing in another context. So it's complicated. What about connecting families when there is no disaster, when you're dealing with refugees in other contexts? And there are special concerns that come up for particular classes of individuals, victims of domestic violence, some of whom in the United States refused services lest their location be entered into databases and the people and essentially their husbands who were battering them would be able to find them. Also, political dissidents have concerns. It's already been mentioned here. And ordinary record keepers who are not involved normally in missing persons have questions. Can I use my data in a missing persons context? I never thought of that before. I didn't provide, in describing how I'm going to use records, the possibility that I would share my records for missing persons. So you take an agency that serves a middle-class constituency. It never considered that its constituents would get tied up in an earthquake and would be they would be asked to share data with emergency services and other organizations. Is it legal? And then, of course, we have crowdsourced activities that arise, and these too can be subject to data protection restrictions, at least in principle. So everybody really needs to know what to do. Rather remarkably, and I'm going back to New Zealand again, after the Christchurch earthquake, New Zealand immediately, and I mean within 24 hours, developed a code, a temporary code, defining what were permitted purposes for data sharing. And this was based in part on a previous experience in Australia, and New Zealand now has a permanent code defining these things. But there doesn't seem to be any equivalent in the EU. I want to turn briefly just to talk about export controls, because in a missing persons context, there are concerns about individuals that transcend borders all the time. No disaster is local to one jurisdiction. There are always people in other jurisdictions who have concerns about folks in the disaster area. And so how do you export data? The US has no restrictions on data exports as a very broad rule, but obviously that is not the case elsewhere. And it's harder to find clear justification under the EU directive for data exports. Again, we come back to the standards that I've talked about before, public interest grounds or protecting the vital interests of data subjects. Now, when you begin to look at these terms, for something to be in the public interest, it must be necessary or legally required. This is a high standard. And it may require national legislation or some official determination to define what is in the public interest. For something to be in the vital interest of the data subject, it must be necessary. Well, what does this mean in a missing persons context? Is letting the family know the status of a family member necessary? Is it always necessary? For how long is it necessary? Is giving missing persons information to an intermediary, of which we have several representatives here, for possible transfer to a family, is that necessary? We don't know that it's going to reach the family. We just know that it might reach the family. What happens if a missing persons organization chooses to make the information that it gets public because that's what it thinks is the best approach? Does that meet the standard? And it's tempting simply to say yes, but it simply isn't clear. And so in coming to the end of our report, we made drew some conclusions and suggested strategies for various players. I'm not going to talk about all the different ideas that we put forward, but we think that data protection authorities in Europe, particularly, but elsewhere as well, need to provide guidance. They need to fill the gaps here. They need to say what is in the vital interest, what is in the public interest in the context of missing persons. The Data Protection Agency conference in 2011 passed a resolution calling on governments and DPAs to address the missing persons issue. Again, we see the hand of Blair Stewart here, who was able to, working with others, develop that recommendation, that resolution, based on the experience in New Zealand. And I think that it is possible, and I think it is appropriate, I think it is necessary for data protection authorities to pay attention to this and provide some guidance. And given that the European Union is considering revising its approach to data protection, this may be an appropriate place to do it. And I will turn it back to Joel to talk about that a little bit.
Great. I'm actually going to start our discussion just with throwing out a couple interesting things I gleaned from the different presentations. If we think about the number of data subjects that are going to be involved in these systems, we've heard about responders, so the teams, the boots on the ground that the ICRC, Refugees United has in different places. The reporting person, there's information about the reporting person as well. From things like PersonFinder, it's the reporting individuals, information, what their connection is to a missing individual relates to them. Social media, and then the missing person, it's him or herself. Each of those have different interests at stake in how the information is circulating, and the number of countries that all of these systems are crossing. How does the technology deal with localizing the data sources? So is it a repository database? Is it a search function? Is it pushing? Is it pulling data? The purposes, Bob, you were just saying about post-emergency uses, storage duration, all of these things seem to be extremely complex to deal with. I'm going to throw out a question for the panelists. I mean, how, as a practical matter, do some of these issues play into what you're doing? Because I think it's important to understand how practically it's playing in to then think about, Bob, your suggestion of having some sort of recital or specification, at least in EU law, about missing person systems.
Well, it's quite a complex legal matter, and I don't have a legal background, neither a technical background. So I will answer I will give my practitioners, I would say, experience on that. I mean, speaking on behalf of the ICRC, and because we work together with a network of national Red Cross and Red Crescent Society around the world. And there is really two needs that we have. We need to get access to reliable data, mostly from the authorities, but not only from the authorities. So how can we secure the access to the data in order to fulfill the mandate that we have, restoring family links and protecting people? That's an issue that we have to work on, I mean, with the authorities in different contexts, and the answer might differ depending on the status of the national societies, depending on negotiation that we had and the mandate that they have. Then the second would say that how can we transmit, because we need also to transmit information across border. It's clear when you have a missing person, when you have tracing request taken, for example, in Great Britain about a refugee in Sudan. I mean, this information has to cross borders, and it goes from EU context with a strong data protection law to a country where probably there is no data protection law, so no equivalent level of protection. So our way of answering to that concern is first, of course, distinguishing between security, really, I would say, sensitive data and less sensitive data, having security safeguards concerning how we transfer, trying to protect data as much as we can, and also being careful about with which organization, how we will share this data. So it's very important not to modify the purpose for which the data was collected at the first hand. And when we are able to locate the missing person, as we cannot ask the question of consent for this missing person, it is important for us to ask the person whether he wants to restore contact with his family member. And if he doesn't want, we don't give back any information to the inquirer. So this is part of the procedure we have to implement, I would say, data protection across borders, but there's still a concern for ICRC of being prevented for national society, ICRC having access to reliable data by state authorities during disasters or during any kind of crisis, and being constraints to, I would say, to have a lot of constraints concerning the transfer of information across borders. So this is really a subject of interpretation that is quite important for us.
Romain, can I just ask quickly, is that decision tree or how you make decisions documented and publicly available, or is it a case-by-case internal discussion?
Well, I would say we have general procedures and we have general guidelines, and they are shared with national societies. So, for example, when I mentioned that every time we meet, if you have the chance to locate a missing person, we ask him or we ask her about a consent to have his family informed about her whereabouts. And even it comes to certain cases when we have to say to the family that the search was not successful, even if it's not true. So this is a way to respect. So it means that the right, the consent to information for us is more important to the right of the family to know about the fate, the whereabouts of the missing person. So this is something that is shared across, all national society and ICRC delegation. Now, about knowing which kind of information can be shared with which information, which kind of information needs to be collected from which authorities, this is really an ad hoc situation. We have to make a specific assessment, I would say.
Well, I just want to make a point. I come at this from the legal side, but in my contacts with missing persons organizations, one of the themes I've heard over and over again, having nothing to do with the law, is the importance that the organizations and themselves and the agencies and other groups that they deal with have pre-existing understandings with others so that everybody knows who everybody is and what they're doing in advance. And obviously advanced planning makes a big difference when a disaster hits. And I think that's perfectly clear in many contexts. It's also very true in the privacy context, because when you're coming along and you're trying to decide on course of activity and information sharing, when the question comes up, is it legal, and you have to go find a lawyer and ask the question, everything stops. And in the middle of a disaster, there's no time for everything to stop. And so that's one of the reasons it's really important that some of these things get resolved to some extent or to a greater extent in advance.
Or it doesn't stop and it turns out after the fact not to have been legal. I want to pick up something that Romain mentioned about having limited purpose, that you don't use the information for other things, and tie it to one of the observations Hiroshi made on the big data analytics. Hiroshi, after the Japan earthquake, the analytics that you mentioned that were used to try to better understand the dynamics and plan for future emergencies, how much of that analysis took place on data that might have been provided for the purpose of finding people? I think that you mentioned geolocation information, which would just have been generated by cell phones or GPS or tracking devices ordinarily. But was other information used in the analytics that was acquired, say, through, I don't want to use PersonFinder, but that sort of notion that families or responders were putting information into, say, social media, and that was being mined for information about response?
Well, that's a very good question, because this, as I mentioned, big data analytics after the earthquake was just started last March 2013. So we just started this kind of project. And you know, the geolocation, GPS information has been recorded as a sensitive data in Japan. But this project covered not the data itself. They use the pseudonymized data or anonymous data in order to analyze people's behavior after the earthquake. So this kind of, the analytics will help the future shelter evacuation and future preparation for the earthquake, I think.
What about the tweets? Were those anonymized as well? I see in your list here you indicate text and tweets. The reason I ask is it's interesting because if you think of, if those are being done for the purpose of simply finding someone, and now they're being analyzed afterwards, it's a secondary use. And how do we, clearly there is an important interest in that secondary use. But I think in part, Romain, by your terms, you wouldn't permit that. Maybe that's going a little too far.
Well, I think it's a challenge. The one involved in big data don't like so much, the constraints of purpose limitation, because the use of big data is to take, a very vast amount of data. Nigel can speak better than me about that kind of issues, and to make, and to find maybe leads, to find elements that we don't know in advance. So that's part of the problem related to big data and issue of privacy. So I don't have a particular comment about big data, but I think there is really data protection issues at the end.
Nigel?
I am exactly the wrong person to talk about Twitter's privacy policies and other things. But I did want to make the point that it's really clear when and again, I'm not a lawyer, so be careful with what I say. But as an operator who works in the space of looking at what people post on Twitter, on Google's networks, on various community bulletin boards and blogs and so forth, in the very public sphere during disasters to try and find out what's happening, this content is posted explicitly by people for public consumption, right? And so I think when you talk about intent, you have to take that into account, right? That when people are posting on Twitter, when people are posting on community networks, when people are posting, writing on blogs about what's happened, when journalists are writing about what's happened, they've interviewed people and so forth, it's very much in that same domain. And so I actually don't, the technical terms around secondary use, etc., isn't where I'm going with this. It's just more the fact that it's very much should be regarded, I think, in that same domain of information. And so how it's mined and used for information about situational awareness, which operational response agencies, of which I used to be a part, use that information to determine what services need to be provided, what people's needs are in different locations. It's certainly what they do right now. You look at how UNOCHA, the UN, uses Twitter information right now for determining prioritization of services. So I think it's a very different circumstance from the kind of consent that the ICRC or Humanity United gets when they're doing an in-person interview with someone about family links and tracing and the kind of discussion they have versus someone making a post in a very public sphere on a blog or website or a social media network, right?
But, so this is an interesting point for me because I think Google PersonFinder came up in response to all these forums where people were just putting anything and everything. And one of the ideas behind Google PersonFinder, or a system that could be connected to other systems, was that you could, in essence, protect people a little bit more than if they were doing it on a forum. So
you certainly see that if you go to the Philippines from hurricane, the recent cyclone Yolanda in the Philippines, and we'll talk more about it this afternoon as a community, I think. But you looked at the way that governments, NGOs, communities were posting huge lists of information by village with lots of location information in very public posts in newspapers, right? You know, all sorts of organizations were doing that. And it's you know, one of the things I'm really glad of for PersonFinder is that we've tried to build in through PersonFinder's interchange format, the way we do our APIs, the way we build the model, and the way we inform users about, you know, basically protecting their interests in that way.
So that, my comment on that leads me to the question, compared to other Google services, how is Google Crisis Response or PersonFinder different in its privacy policy in regards to users that input information, and how do you notify them in a different way? Sorry.
Don't be sorry. So let's just be clear. I'm here talking about our missing person stuff and our crisis response stuff. I'm not going to comment about the broader sort of Google services, but there's a couple of things about PersonFinder is that it's governed by our privacy policies. And we think very much that the way we've done the sort of notifications and reviews and everything else are very much best practice for this whole community. And one of the things about PersonFinder, and this goes back to ICRC's work with Romain, is that we use it explicitly at Google for large-scale natural disasters in short term. We never leave it up for very long. And we're very explicit the data gets deleted, and we require anyone we share the data with to delete it as well. And so it's actually inappropriate for being used for conflict situations or circumstances where you want to do long-term family tracing, right? And we have numerous requests for PersonFinder in these circumstances, and we say no very explicitly, right? It's an open source project, so people can adapt it and use it how they choose. But for our uses and purposes, we're very clear about that. And that's just us doing what we feel is very much case by case, but what we feel are very much best practices for privacy on this.
Let me see if there are any questions in the room. Yes. Yeah, speak up a little. Oh, we have a mic coming.
Okay, I'm attending this session from the perspective of in-house counsel at a private company that is subject to the EU data protection laws. And one of the things that our company is doing is developing a crisis management team to be able to respond if, for example, there's a natural disaster and, you know, we have employees all over the world who need to be evacuated or found. And I'm wondering if there's any guidance on how a company might go about doing this and still adhering to the EU privacy laws.
I'm not sure that there really is. Because the law is unclear. I think that one thing that you can do at a company level is try your best to foresee how data might be used. I don't know what your company is or what kind of data you have or how it would be useful, but try and foresee how it might be used once the question comes up. Can we, and see what kinds of relationships you might want to have with organizations that are represented here or whatever. And in defining your own purposes for which you have information and which you will disclose information, you may want to have a contingent one that says, in the case of a natural disaster, we will do these sorts of disclosures to these types of organizations for this period of time, for this purpose, and then your own people have some guidance as to when something stops and starts and what's appropriate. And until you get some kind of more official recognition like we have in New Zealand, you have to fend for yourself.
Let me throw in just 2 quick points as well. Something that you might want to think, I'm reminded of September 11th in New York, where I'm from. And this was a big issue for companies trying to simply locate their staff. And the companies set up essentially their own internal location services. They had calling chains, they had identified a person who would receive and just compile that information. In doing that for a company, if that's the model that you're thinking of as opposed to relying on external agencies, it'll be important to think about where you locate that center. What are the technologies being used? Which legal regime are you under? Because there are differences across countries. And the second point I just wanted to make is Bob's drafted a best practices document that might be of some kind of help in that context.
The document is really for the MPCI and for its members, and it's really based on fair information practices. It's all the familiar principles that all the national laws are based on. But that's a pretty good, fair information practices are a pretty good checklist for whatever you're doing in the privacy regime.
Good, another, yes, sir.
Thanks. Sorry. Andrea Damini, Data Protection Coordinator and Directorate General for Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection of the European Commission. Before, I'm colleague director from the very good discussion, very interesting, and actually showing me a field that I don't understand directly, that was directly linked with my daily job and the daily job of my Directorate General. I have, let's say, odd reactions, let's say, personal thoughts made during the, and I cannot speak directly on behalf of my organization, so clearly. But when I see the immediate best consequences of some services like the PersonFinder of Google. At the same time, I have big fears. First of all, because coming from Google, but also because it's missing, at least in Europe, a framework for this type of things. First of all, there is no exception, or the situation is not directly targeted in current data protection policies. It could be now still a good moment in order to reflect if there is possible to introduce in the actual reform of the data protection policy. And at the same time, what was not directly addressed in the discussion, the recovery phase. That means it is also clear for me personally that at the crisis moment, there is an overwhelming need to collect information made available without consent of the data person. But at least in Europe, we can assume that the recovery phase begins in a few minutes after the crisis, more or less. But from the formal point of view, yes, we can say, even in an event, very big event targeting a whole city, but the state around the city and the member states, speaking from the European Union point of view, will help, and the recovery, the emergency phase and the recovery phase will begin. And this is also the point because this target the control of the data, the collected data. I'm personally convinced that people will post information publicly about missing person, about himself, but with a specific purpose. And the purpose has to be respected and not misused for other uses. In particularly, there is a lot of discussion of use of data from private firms. Google stay a big example of this discussion ongoing. On the other side, I think that also in Europe we have the most of the countries are based on civil law. Also, this data should be collected from the law.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, do you have a question that you wanted the panel to respond to?
Actually, sorry, I have no question, but okay. the theme is relevant for my organization that I have to express some personal thoughts also in order to have a reaction from your side. But I'm finishing
We're getting
in
close
a
to our
minute.
time frame. I wanted to be sure if there were questions, we could also get them.
The point
Yes.
that if I'm thinking of now, I will see that the public authorities should be at end responsible for the data, or they should take over the control and the ownership of the data, because we, the public authorities are also responsible for civil status, and the data will be so sensitive and so important for all rights and management within the state that they should take over the control and the ownership.
So let me take that as a question in a sense that I'm going to pose to the panel, because I think that's a very provocative comment, that the data should, I'm going to perhaps paraphrase what you were saying, at the end of the crisis period, when the immediate crisis is over, that those data sets should be turned over to a public authority. I can imagine that perhaps, Christopher, you might have a reaction to that, or Romain.
I think I'll make a bit of a broader comment also to what we spoke about before. I think it's important for everybody on this panel and for the audience and for lawmakers and regulators around the world to be cognizant of the fact that it's 2014 and information is not going to respect privacy laws. Once information is out there, it's out there. It's going to get passed between people on Facebook, on Twitter, on Google, on Refugees United. Thank you.
Break is about to start.
I want a cape like that, by the way.
Now that is a cool cape.
The reality is that whether we want it or not, information is going to spread, and it's going to spread very quickly. So the more we can control that phase at the first step and ensure that it is a responsible company, however you define that, where we know the procedures of this company and how they go about treating the data is very important. Because it's kind of like sometimes when I look at how we respond to data privacy and how we look at family tracing and so on, I can't help but think of the year 2000 and Napster and the old record companies. And everybody said, you know what, you're not allowed to do this, and you can't do such and so, but no matter how you twist and turn it, the information just flows freely, and people want access to it, and they're going to get it. So that's where I think we should really start looking at the source and the ideas from the beginning of how do we actually want to respond to this from a broader community side, perhaps in partnership between the governments and the private companies, but stay cognizant of the fact that the world of 2014 is vastly different from what it was 20 years ago, 30, 50, 60 years ago.
Any final comment?
Well, working for the ICRC and working with National Society, Red Cross National Society, they are in partnership with government, with the authorities. So they have to discuss together, what kind of duties are assigned to, for example, the Red Cross in dealing with the data, sensitive data. In a lot of contexts where we work, we have to substitute, I would say, to state authorities, because sometimes they are kind of failing states or disorganized states due to the crisis. But as soon as, I would say, there is a recovery phase, yes, there is an engagement to discuss with the authorities, because after all, it's the role of the authorities to try to help the people in the country where the crisis strikes. So it's right, to distinguish between the emergency crisis or between a period of phase where the authorities don't have, the possibility, the extent of resources to really help the people to the recovery phase, where the situation goes back to normal and maybe a data protection regulation normal should apply.
My comment really doesn't address, I think, the broader concerns, because I think they're really good things to talk about. But I think you need to think about that picture that was posted from Japan, which I've seen all over the world in lots of different circumstances, in person and in photos, is the age-old tradition of people after a disaster, when they've lost track of their loved ones, of putting names on a notice board. They're publicly sharing and asking others to help them find the basic question of, have you seen this person? Right? My brother, my sister, my father, whatever. And how we use technology as a shout box, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's on a tool like PersonFinder, right, to satisfy that basic need in those moments after a disaster is really critical. It's a great service, we provide it. Others provide it, so the American Red Cross, the ICRC, Humanitarian United, others. But we're all grappling with this challenge about how to make sure that it's used well but not abused, right? And this is an ongoing discussion. It's not going to end here. And every time we launch PersonFinder, we certainly learn something new about how it's used. We certainly learn new constraints about how it should be used better, and how our partners want to use it in different ways. And it just builds our knowledge base and our partnerships. And this is one of the comments that was made over and over again, is that those partnerships, be they with agencies, with NGOs, which we work with again and again in different locations, and even with governments upon occasion, is absolutely critical. And I find it's interesting that we're often educating them about the role of technology and internet in these circumstances, because most people don't quite get what's changing so quickly in 2014, as you mentioned.
So I'll close us with that thought. You know, it's about how it's used and not abused. I like that phrase, and put a challenge out, which is to really encourage those looking at data protection law to do the kind of review and push on the review that Hiroshi mentioned, that Bob mentioned, to see how those laws address exceptions for emergency situations, and to try to contemplate, think in advance. Advanced planning is clearly so essential in this environment. So with that, let me ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific discussion.